Sidebar family. Buckle in, because tonight the floor drops. Everything you thought you knew about the D4vd case is about to flip, and I'll tell you exactly why. Because after this multi-day preliminary hearing in Los Angeles, after days of testimony, after photographs so graphic a courtroom went silent, after the prosecutor threatened to have a licensed private investigator arrested on the record, and after a judge officially cleared the road for D4vd, the R&B singer once celebrated for a viral heartbreak anthem, to stand trial for the alleged murder of a 14-year-old girl, one thing is now painfully clear. This case is not what the headlines told you. This case is bigger, darker, and structurally weaker in places you would never expect, and stronger in places the defense cannot touch. And the man who has been inside that courtroom from the very first hearing, the man they physically escorted out because a prosecutor did not want him within 10 feet of the family, is finally speaking, and what he is saying is going to detonate the internet. Because tonight, we are ripping the roof off this entire preliminary hearing. Right out the gate, Private Investigator Steve Fisher, the man tied to the property where D4vd was allegedly staying, the man who has been at every hearing, the man who publicly disclosed the burn cage, the chainsaw, the 4 terabytes of surveillance footage that was allegedly allowed to be overwritten by investigators, that man was hauled up in open court and accused of breaking grand jury secrecy laws. The prosecutor, Beth Silverman, spun around in front of a courtroom full of reporters, pointed at him, and demanded a warrant. The judge, cool and composed, listened. And Steve Fisher? He was excluded. He was walked out. And then, off the record, a bailiff quietly confirmed to him that there was, in fact, no warrant at all. Cold. Ice cold. My God. And that is only the appetizer. Because tonight I have to walk you through the strongest evidence in the D4vd case, the weakest evidence in the D4vd case, the exact charge that legal analysts are quietly calling almost impossible to beat, the exact charge where the prosecution may have already overreached, the chainsaw the LAPD cannot find, the pool the defense says was for a music video, the 11 air fresheners inside that Tesla, the tattooed finger that is missing, and the one single missing witness that could blow the first-degree murder charge wide open. So let's get into it, because this one is layered, and we are going to peel it back one strip at a time. Let me back this up for a second. The story begins in April of 2025. Prosecutors allege that D4vd, whose legal name is David Anthony Burke, lured Celeste Rivas Hernandez, a 14-year-old girl from a family that never wanted to be in the spotlight, into his home. They allege that D4vd stabbed her, that D4vd stood there or sat there or watched as she bled out, and that D4vd then, over the next 12 days, allegedly dismembered her body inside a residence that was not even legally his. Her remains, according to the prosecution, were later discovered inside a Tesla registered to D4vd himself, wrapped, sealed, and drenched in the smell of decomposition that 11 separate air fresheners could not cover. Prosecutors say all of it, every horrific detail, was allegedly done to hide an illegal sexual relationship D4vd had allegedly been carrying on with a child since she was 13 years old. And listen, you already know I have to say this. D4vd is legally innocent until proven guilty. Every word of this is an allegation. Every claim is unproven. The defense has not even fully argued its case yet. But the judge, after listening to days of preliminary testimony, ruled that there is enough probable cause for D4vd to move forward to trial. And that ruling alone changed the shape of this entire story, because it means the world is now going to see, in open court, the evidence prosecutors have been guarding for months. Now in fairness, a preliminary hearing is not the full case. Prosecutors do not have to show every card. In fact, LA County District Attorney Nathan Hawkman practically admitted on camera that what the public saw was, quote, a significant but small fraction, end quote, of what the prosecution actually intends to present at trial. That means the burn cage still has a story. That means the chainsaw still has a story. That means the 4 terabytes of surveillance footage still has a story. And that means Steve Fisher, the investigator who has been sitting feet away from D4vd in that courtroom for months, may have information that the public has not touched yet. Which is why I need you to hear directly what Steve Fisher told me. Because the man was inside that courtroom for days. Steve Fisher sat behind D4vd, close enough to reach out and touch him, close enough to study his face while a medical examiner detailed how long a 14-year-old girl might have taken to die. And Steve Fisher said something that I have not been able to shake. He said D4vd is small. He said D4vd is barely bigger than the girl he is accused of killing. He said D4vd sits in that courtroom looking almost detached, as if the weight of the accusation is not landing on him, and Steve Fisher believes that has to be an act, because no human being spends every hour of every day inside a cell accused of what D4vd is accused of and feels nothing. Steve Fisher, a man who has spent his career close to defendants, called it strange. Called it surreal. Called it hard to be there. And this is a man who does not rattle. Piled on top of that, Steve Fisher said what many of you have been asking online. If D4vd is truly this small, how does D4vd do all of this alone? How does D4vd carry a body? How does D4vd operate a chainsaw allegedly in the middle of the night in a remote Santa Barbara canyon that even Steve Fisher describes as a road that only leads to a Boy Scout camp? Steve Fisher did not say D4vd had help. Steve Fisher said the size question is a question. And in a courtroom, questions like that are exactly the wedge a defense attorney drives straight into the heart of a first-degree murder charge. Regardless. Let me walk you through the 4 major charges D4vd is facing, because not all of them are created equal, and understanding that difference is the entire game. Charge 1, and I will tell you right now this is the one legal analysts are quietly calling the closer, is continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14. And sidebar family, if the evidence teased in that preliminary hearing is even a fraction of what the prosecution is holding, this charge is a fortress. Prosecutors displayed, in open court, descriptions of extremely graphic photographs allegedly recovered from D4vd's phone. Photographs allegedly showing D4vd engaged in sexual acts with a minor. Text messages allegedly referencing an abortion. Testimony from a West Hollywood sheriff's deputy who reportedly told D4vd, to his face, that the girl he was involved with was a 13-year-old runaway. Testimony that D4vd knew her school. Testimony that D4vd allegedly used phones passed to her through her own classmates just to keep the communication going. And here is the closing shot. Prosecutor Beth Silverman told the court that even if the girl had lied about her age, that is not a legal defense. Not for a child under 14. Not in California. Even the defense, in its own closing, seemingly conceded emotionally that D4vd, quote, was in love with her, end quote, which is a phrase that inside a case involving a 14-year-old is not a defense at all. It is a confession dressed as sympathy. So on that first charge, the prosecution's evidence is not just strong. It is, based on what has been shown, close to airtight. Charge 2, unlawful mutilation of human remains. And this is where the case starts to get genuinely nightmarish. Prosecutors laid out a chain of evidence that a jury will not forget. That Tesla registered to D4vd, according to prosecutors, reeked so strongly that 11 separate air fresheners were placed inside it. 11. Not 1. Not 3. 11. The victim's passport was allegedly recovered on a remote roadside in Santa Barbara County, roughly a 2-hour drive from D4vd's home. Phone data and Tesla data allegedly show D4vd traveling to that same remote Santa Barbara area multiple times, the first trip beginning on the night of April 23 of 2025, allegedly hours after prosecutors say Celeste was killed. Prosecutors say D4vd allegedly purchased chainsaws. Prosecutors say D4vd allegedly purchased a mop system. Prosecutors say D4vd allegedly purchased cadaver bags. Prosecutors say D4vd allegedly ordered a blue inflatable pool, delivered to the home under an alias, and that pool, allegedly cut and damaged, was later reportedly recovered in the garage. Prosecutors say blue plastic fragments matching that pool were allegedly embedded in the victim's remains. Prosecutors say the tattoo of D4vd's own name that Celeste had inked on her left ring finger, that specific finger was gone from her body when it was recovered. Gone. As if someone knew that finger could identify her. Now the defense pushed back, and pushed back hard. The defense argued D4vd did not personally purchase all of those items. The defense argued the 2 chainsaws that were recovered inside D4vd's home tested negative for blood. The defense argued there is a possibility of a missing 3rd chainsaw that has never been located. The defense argued that fake blood was found inside the home. The defense argued that the pool, the tarps, the mop system, could all be innocently explained as props for a planned music video shoot. And Steve Fisher, sitting inside that courtroom, quietly told me he agrees the mutilation charge is strong. But Steve Fisher also said something that stopped me cold. Steve Fisher said if it is that stupid to leave a pool with cuts and blue plastic in your own garage, then either D4vd is that stupid, or D4vd knew he was going to get caught, and D4vd was almost waiting for it. Waiting. Charge 3. Concealing evidence. And here is where the story turns into something out of a thriller. Steve Fisher suspects the missing chainsaw, the one investigators cannot account for, may be in Santa Barbara. Steve Fisher thinks that second or third trip D4vd allegedly took to that area, around Cinco de Mayo, around May 8, may have been a disposal run. Steve Fisher said the exact spot where the victim's ID was recovered is deep, remote, and nearly impossible to know about unless someone had been there before. Steve Fisher has been there. Steve Fisher described the road as a strip of asphalt that only spurs off into a Boy Scout camp. Which raises a question the prosecution has not yet publicly answered. How did D4vd, allegedly in the middle of the night, know to go there? Charge 4. First-degree murder with special circumstances. Lying in wait. Killing a witness. Killing for financial gain. This is the charge that carries the death penalty. This is the charge that could put D4vd in a California death row cell for the rest of his life. And sidebar family, this is the charge that, based purely on what was shown at the preliminary hearing, has the most exposure for the prosecution. Because the defense is already laying tracks. The defense argues Celeste allegedly invited herself over. The defense argues the Uber driver cannot conclusively confirm where Celeste was dropped off. The defense argues there is no surveillance footage confirming Celeste entering that home. The defense argues Celeste allegedly sent D4vd threatening messages. The defense argues D4vd was allegedly at home playing virtual reality games as she was on her way, and told her, allegedly, that he had left the door open, which does not read like a man rehearsing an ambush. And there is the mother of all wrinkles. There were reports that D4vd's own parents may have been at that residence at the time. So who exactly was in the house that night? The prosecution has not fully answered that either. Let me pause here and hit you with something almost nobody is talking about. In the prosecution's own written brief, they used a very specific phrase. They said D4vd, quote, watched her bleed out, end quote. Or that D4vd stood by as if watching her bleed out. Read that sentence again. Because that phrasing suggests one of two things. Either there is a witness. Or D4vd confessed to somebody. And Nathan Hawkman himself, the LA district attorney, seemingly used a phrase in a press conference that he almost tried to walk back in real time. Hawkman used the phrase, quote, percipient witnesses, end quote, which in legal English means witnesses who directly observed something. And when Steve Fisher flagged that word publicly on X, my stomach dropped. Because if the prosecution has a percipient witness they have not yet revealed, this case is not just moving to trial. This case is being loaded like a cannon. And listen, this ties directly into the strangest financial subplot in this whole story. Because during the preliminary hearing, prosecutors put on a financial advisor. That financial advisor, under oath, was forced to admit that he had lied during his grand jury testimony. He originally told the grand jury he never asked D4vd's associate, Rob, what happened to the girl, because, quote, he did not want to know. But then, in open court, the same financial advisor admitted that he did ask Rob, and Rob did tell him. What Rob told him has not been revealed publicly yet. But the very next thread in that testimony was even more disturbing. That within days of the alleged killing, before the body was even identified as Celeste, D4vd's inner circle allegedly began raising $2 million in bond money. $2 million. Before there was even a public confirmation of who the body belonged to. That is not the behavior of people who do not know what happened. That is the behavior of people who know exactly what is coming. Piled on top of that, we now have the astonishing story of what happened to Steve Fisher inside that courtroom, because it says something about the emotional temperature of this prosecution. Steve Fisher told me, on the record, that he was standing in the hallway outside the courtroom when a man in a suit approached him and introduced himself as Patrick Steinfeld, the attorney representing Celeste's family. Steve Fisher says he did not seek out the family. Steve Fisher says Steinfeld initiated the interaction. Steinfeld thanked Steve Fisher for keeping this case in the public conversation. And Steve Fisher, being a licensed investigator, asked how the family was holding up. That was the sum total of the conversation. And then, according to Steve Fisher, prosecutor Beth Silverman came storming down the hallway, physically pulled Steinfeld away, and declared the entire conversation illegal in front of a hallway of reporters. Steve Fisher said he was stunned. Steve Fisher said the reporters around him were stunned. Steve Fisher left, went home, came back the next day, sat down inside the courtroom, and moments after proceedings began, Beth Silverman turned around, pointed at him, and said, on the official record, that Steve Fisher had violated grand jury secrecy, that Steve Fisher had approached witnesses illegally, and that Beth Silverman was going to have a warrant issued for Steve Fisher's arrest. In open court. To a private investigator who had been legally cooperating from day one. And the judge, according to Steve Fisher, remained calm and professional and told Beth Silverman that the grand jury issue was enough on its own to have Steve Fisher excluded. Steve Fisher agreed to leave voluntarily. But before he left, Steve Fisher politely asked the judge for permission to place one clarifying statement on the record. Steve Fisher stated, plainly, that Steinfeld had approached him. Not the other way around. And then something remarkable happened. Attorney Patrick Steinfeld stood up, in open court, and confirmed on the record that yes, he was the one who approached Steve Fisher. And at that moment, according to Steve Fisher, Beth Silverman spun around and began silently mouthing words at Steinfeld. Silently. Mouthing. At a family attorney. In open court. Regardless. Steve Fisher walked out with a bailiff beside him. And that bailiff quietly told Steve Fisher, off the official record, that no warrant existed. No warrant was issued. No warrant was pending. And Steve Fisher, when he later followed up at the clerk's office, confirmed there was no case number, no docket entry, and no formal filing tied to the threatened warrant. Which means, according to Steve Fisher, a licensed investigator was accused of a crime in open court, in an official transcript, by an elected prosecutor, over an interaction that the other party publicly admitted was not initiated by him. Cold. Ice cold. My God. And I want you to sit with what that tells us. Because Steve Fisher believes, and I will let him speak for himself, that Beth Silverman was using the grand jury as a leash. Steve Fisher says he was subpoenaed to the grand jury twice, but never called as a testifying witness at the preliminary hearing. Steve Fisher says he was told, incorrectly, that he could not speak about the case at all, not to reporters, not to his own client, not ever. Steve Fisher says that is not how the law works. Grand jurors are bound by secrecy. Investigators subpoenaed as witnesses are not gagged from their own casework. Steve Fisher says the effect of the ongoing subpoena was, in practice, a muzzle. And the moment Steve Fisher refused to be muzzled, the moment Steve Fisher publicly pointed out that the burn cage was on the property, that a chainsaw was on the property, that 4 terabytes of surveillance footage from a neighbor's home across the street was allegedly allowed to overwrite before it could be preserved, the temperature between him and the prosecution changed. That is the story Steve Fisher is telling. And it raises questions about the prosecution's posture in this case that go far beyond one investigator. Now in fairness, the prosecution has an incredibly difficult job. This is a nationally televised case. This is a case with a 14-year-old victim whose family should not be dragged through a single second more of pain than the law requires. This is a case where jury contamination is a real fear. So a prosecutor being aggressive about protecting witnesses is not inherently wrong. But aggressive is different from inaccurate. And Steve Fisher's story, if true, and Steinfeld's on-the-record confirmation suggests it is inaccurate. Let me get back to the heart of it, because there is a reason we are talking about all of this. The reason is the murder charge. And when I asked Steve Fisher to tell me, in his gut, whether D4vd did this, Steve Fisher did not hesitate. Steve Fisher said, quote, "I think D4vd did this 100%, end quote." Steve Fisher said he believes it. Steve Fisher said he has been vocal about it. But Steve Fisher also said something every juror is going to have to reckon with. Steve Fisher said there is a difference between believing D4vd did this and proving that D4vd committed first-degree murder with lying in wait, killing of a witness, and killing for financial gain. And Steve Fisher said, in his own analysis, he does not see the luring. He does not see D4vd making desperate promises. He does not see D4vd conning the girl to come over. Steve Fisher sees a text where D4vd allegedly says the door is unlocked. Steve Fisher sees a man allegedly playing a virtual reality game as she was allegedly heading over. Steve Fisher sees a defense narrative that could plausibly land at, this is inappropriate, this is criminal, this is unforgivable, this is even second-degree murder, but this may not be premeditated first-degree with special circumstances. And Steve Fisher said the last text D4vd allegedly sent Celeste was dated April 26 of 2025, 3 days after prosecutors say she was already dead. Which, if the prosecution wants it, is a devastating piece of evidence. Because either D4vd was texting a corpse to establish an alibi, or D4vd was moving too calmly, too quickly, too surgically, for someone who had just been through a spontaneous heat-of-the-moment altercation. That is the choice the jury is going to have to make. Moving on. Next chapter. Because I need to talk to you about the special circumstances, and specifically about the killing for financial gain allegation, because on the strength of the preliminary hearing alone, this is where I have the loudest questions. Prosecutors have suggested Celeste allegedly said, in a text, that she could ruin D4vd. But prosecutors have not, based on what the public has seen, produced evidence that Celeste specifically threatened to go to the police, threatened to go to law enforcement, threatened to file a formal report. Ruining someone in the vernacular of a 14-year-old girl is not the same as testifying against them. So the killing a witness special circumstance may be more legally fragile than it looks in a headline. And killing for financial gain requires proof of a financial motive. But according to what the financial advisor testified to, D4vd allegedly did not even know how much money he was worth. Which cuts hard against the theory of a killing for money. So the special circumstances may not all survive to trial in the form they were charged. Some may be pleaded down. Some may be dropped. And Steve Fisher put it in a way I want you to hear. Steve Fisher said this is not about whether D4vd walks free. Steve Fisher said this is about whether we are talking about a death penalty case being reduced to life without parole, or a life without parole case being reduced to something less. That is the level the fight is happening at. Not innocence versus guilt. Charging levels. And listen, you already know this. Steve Fisher's belief is not a jury's verdict. His instinct is not evidence. His years inside this investigation are not admissible testimony. The court will decide. But when the private investigator who has been closer to this case than nearly any human being on the outside says the mutilation charge is strong, the sexual abuse charge is unbreakable, and the first-degree murder charge is exposed on premeditation, that is a scouting report the entire trial world just heard. Now let me stitch together something that has been bothering me for days. The Santa Barbara trips. Prosecutors allege D4vd drove up to that remote canyon area at least 3 separate times. The first trip, according to phone and Tesla data, allegedly began the very night of April 23, hours after Celeste was allegedly killed. Steve Fisher thinks it is plausible that the victim was inside the Tesla during that first trip. The prosecution has publicly framed it differently. But everyone, prosecution, defense, and Steve Fisher, seems to agree that whatever happened during those trips, the ID being recovered by the roadside is not a coincidence. Steve Fisher's theory, and I want you to sit with this, is that the missing chainsaw is somewhere in that area. Steve Fisher thinks the second or third trip, timed around Cinco de Mayo and May 8, may have been a disposal run. Steve Fisher thinks the lake in that area, the terrain, the isolation, the darkness at night, all of it points to a location that D4vd had to already know about. And Steve Fisher, who has physically been out there, said the roads that spider off that main strip lead to a Boy Scout camp and not much else. So how did D4vd know? That is a percipient witness-shaped question. That is the kind of question that produces a name in a witness list nobody has seen yet. That is the kind of question that Nathan Hawkman may have been telegraphing when he said the trial evidence will be significantly larger than what was shown in preliminary. And that is the kind of question that makes me think there is a person out there, somewhere, who knows exactly why D4vd chose that specific place. And when the prosecution decides to put that person on the stand, if that person exists, the entire narrative of this trial changes overnight. Piled on top of that is the strangest evidentiary fact of the entire preliminary hearing. The murder weapon has not been located. The prosecution's own medical examiner testified that because of the state of decomposition of the remains, forensic pathology cannot definitively identify the type or exact size of the blade used. The 2 chainsaws recovered from the home tested negative for blood. There is that suspected missing third chainsaw. And there is the fake blood recovered inside the home, which the defense will absolutely wave in front of a jury as reasonable doubt disguised as a movie prop. This is the reality of this case. No weapon. No confession, publicly. No eyewitness, publicly. What the prosecution has is a mountain of circumstantial evidence stacked so high that it becomes a story a jury can follow. But circumstantial mountains do not always convict on first-degree murder. And that is the thin wire this case is walking on. Now in fairness, circumstantial cases have won convictions before. Scott Peterson. Chandra Levy's killer. This is not novel legal territory. But the prosecution has to sequence its evidence with surgical precision. It has to answer the size question. It has to answer the missing weapon question. It has to answer the missing chainsaw question. It has to answer the who else was in the house question. It has to explain the parents. It has to explain the Uber. It has to explain the phone activity. And it has to do all of it while the defense will be, at every opportunity, whispering into the jury's ear that D4vd was a predator, absolutely, but not a premeditated killer. The defense will argue Celeste showed up. The defense will argue something snapped. The defense will argue self-defense. The defense will argue a 14-year-old girl and a grown man, alone in a house, ended in a tragedy that is second degree, that is voluntary manslaughter, that is anything but the calculated ambush the state is trying to sell. And when I asked Steve Fisher if that pivot to second degree could work, Steve Fisher, again, did not blink. Steve Fisher said the defense will not deny that D4vd was a predator. Steve Fisher said the defense's closing already implicitly conceded that D4vd, quote, was in love with her, end quote. Steve Fisher said the defense's entire pathway to survival is not innocence. It is degree. And in a California courtroom, the difference between first degree with special circumstances and second degree can be the difference between an execution chamber and a parole hearing 30 years from now. And listen, you already know I have to keep saying this. D4vd is innocent unless the state proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Every claim tonight is an allegation. Every source discussed is a source, not a fact. Every theory Steve Fisher laid out is a theory. The evidence has not been fully tested. The witnesses have not been fully cross-examined. The trial has not begun. What I am telling you tonight is what a preliminary hearing revealed, and how a man who has watched every second of it reads what he saw. But there is one part of this hearing that broke me. And it broke Steve Fisher too. When the descriptions of the photographs of Celeste's body parts were introduced. When the descriptions of the alleged graphic photos on D4vd's phone were introduced. When you realize that if this case goes to trial, 12 strangers on a jury will have to sit and look at those images, and Celeste's mother, and Celeste's father, will have to sit in that same courtroom while those images are shown, that is a level of horror that no verdict can undo. And Steve Fisher said something to me that I have been carrying since. Steve Fisher said when this case began, when Steve Fisher first came onto this show at the very beginning, before he was legally allowed to say anything about the burn cage, before he was legally allowed to say anything about the chainsaw, Steve Fisher told me only one thing. Steve Fisher said, quote, there are going to be some things we disclose that are going to be really sadistic in nature, end quote. And Steve Fisher said, months later, sitting inside that courtroom, that word, sadistic, does not feel strong enough anymore. And that is the emotional weight of this case. It is not a rap sheet. It is not a headline. It is not a viral thumbnail. It is a 14-year-old girl whose family did not want the spotlight. It is a family who now walks into a courthouse and sits within arm's reach of the accused. It is a family that Steinfeld is trying to shield from the world. And it is a case in which the alleged evidence is so brutal that a preliminary hearing alone was described by veteran reporters as one of the most difficult they had ever covered. So where does this go from here? D4vd is scheduled to appear next on August 31st for formal arraignment, where the charges will be officially read. Between now and then, expect motion practice. Expect defense filings challenging the special circumstances. Expect the prosecution to hold back its heaviest evidence for the trial itself. Expect Steinfeld to keep the family shielded. Expect Steve Fisher to keep pressing. Expect the media pool around this case to keep growing. And expect, at some point, a percipient witness whose name we have not yet heard to step forward. Because I do not believe, and Steve Fisher does not believe, that the prosecution's use of that word in court was accidental. Word making the rounds is that when this case reaches trial, prosecutors will present phone records, geolocation data, purchase records, delivery logs, DNA evidence, and biological evidence recovered from the Tesla that were not fully presented at preliminary. Word making the rounds is that the LAPD, despite Steve Fisher's public criticism, has been operating a wider evidentiary net than what was publicly revealed. Word making the rounds is that there is more from the burn cage than anyone has confirmed. And the sources close to the case are saying that some of the evidence has not been publicly disclosed for strategic reasons, precisely because the defense would spend the next 6 months attacking it before trial. That is standard prosecutorial posture. That is not a smoking gun. But it is a signal, and it is a signal that anyone reading this case only from what happened in preliminary is reading only the first 10 pages of a much longer book. Now in fairness, the defense is not without its arsenal either. Expect the defense to attack chain of custody on the Tesla. Expect the defense to attack the reliability of Tesla and phone geolocation. Expect the defense to elevate the missing chainsaw, the fake blood, the pool, the mop system, the tarps, the cadaver bags, all of it, as circumstantial props that were purchased or delivered under aliases that D4vd may or may not have controlled personally. Expect the defense to lean, hard, on the argument that Celeste allegedly came to that home willingly. Expect the defense to raise mental health context. Expect the defense to raise the parents. Expect the defense to raise whoever else may have been in that residence at that time. And expect the defense to hammer, again and again, that the prosecution has no murder weapon and no eyewitness to the actual killing. That is the ground on which this trial will be fought. And I have a duty to tell you, this is not a case anyone should be celebrating. Not the outcome, whatever it turns out to be. Not the theater around it. Not the online frenzy. A 14-year-old girl is dead. A family is broken. A community is grieving. A parent had to identify their child from remains that had been separated. There is no verdict on earth that reverses that. What a trial can deliver is not restoration. What a trial can deliver is accountability. And accountability, in a case of this weight, has to be earned by every rule of evidence and every burden of proof American law requires. Which is why the question Steve Fisher is raising matter. Because if any charge is ultimately reversed on appeal because it was overcharged, that is not a technicality. That is a wound to the family that never had to happen. Which is why the fight between Beth Silverman and Steve Fisher matters. Because a case this big cannot afford unforced errors. And why the question about the percipient witness matters. Because if that person exists, that person is the difference between a first-degree conviction and a mistrial. So let me leave you with the pieces we know for certain. We know a judge found probable cause. We know D4vd will stand trial. We know the sexual abuse charge, based on the evidence teased, appears extraordinarily difficult to overcome. We know the mutilation charge is stacked with circumstantial evidence a jury will find hard to ignore. We know the first-degree murder charge, based purely on what was shown in preliminary, has weak spots the defense will exploit. We know the special circumstances are contested. We know the missing chainsaw has not been located. We know there are references to Boy Scout camp roads and remote Santa Barbara canyons that no ordinary person just wanders into at night. We know a financial advisor lied to a grand jury and was forced to correct himself under oath. We know an inner circle allegedly began raising $2 million in bond money before the body was even publicly identified. We know 11 air fresheners were allegedly placed inside that Tesla. We know a tattooed finger was gone. We know a prosecutor accused a licensed investigator of a crime in open court based on a scenario the other party contradicted on the same record. And we know that on August 31st, D4vd will walk into a Los Angeles courtroom and hear his charges read aloud in a formal way that begins the long, slow, painful march to trial. Sidebar family, this is where I stand tonight. I stand with the family. I stand with the truth, whatever the trial ultimately reveals. And I stand with the position that every American, even one accused of something as horrific as what D4vd is accused of, is entitled to have every element of every charge proved beyond a reasonable doubt. That is not a defense of D4vd. That is a defense of the system that eventually will judge D4vd. Because the more airtight the process is, the more airtight the verdict is. And the more airtight the verdict is, the more the family has a chance, someday, to close a door that no one wants to leave open a second longer than it has to be. But in the meantime, drop your take in the comments and let's argue it out. Do you think the prosecution has enough to convict on first-degree murder based on what we saw in preliminary? Or do you think, like Steve Fisher, the mutilation and the sexual abuse charges are the strong pillars and the first-degree murder charge is going to be the fight of the trial? Do you think there is a percipient witness we have not seen yet? Do you think that missing chainsaw is sitting somewhere in a Santa Barbara canyon waiting to be found? Do you think Beth Silverman went too far when she threatened Steve Fisher in open court, or do you think she was defending her case? I want to hear it. All of it. Every angle. Because this is not a story that ends at preliminary. This is a story that is only beginning. And I promise you, we are going to be here every step of the way, until August 31st, until arraignment, until trial, until verdict, and until the last question in this case gets its answer. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I will see you on the next one.